Hello, friends, and welcome to the PrepWell podcast. I'm your host, Phil Black. And if you have an 8th, 9th, or 10th grader with big aspirations, like the Ivy League, or military service academies like West Point, ROTC, or athletic scholarships, boom, you've come to the right place. My specialty, my superpower, if you will, is preparing families for these competitive programs. I'll teach you what your child should do, when they should do it, and how you can help. So stick around and prepare to out-prepare. Hello, friends, and welcome to the show. Today we're going to mix it up a little bit. I'm going to answer some questions that I've received by email, some in person, some through DM on Instagram, some through Facebook, and I'm going to try to move pretty quickly through the answers by going into rapid fire mode. Let's start with question number 1. Do I have to take SAT subject tests? Well, just to make sure we're all on the same page, SAT subject tests are different from the SAT. For those not familiar, SAT subject tests are 1-hour tests that you take on a per subject basis. For example, let's say you're taking U.S. history now. You might consider taking the U.S. history SAT subject test at the end of this year. Now, these tests cover only high school material, not AP material, not college level content, just high school material. Now, as to the question of do you have to take any? Well, they're not required at very many schools anymore, but for many highly selective schools, they are still, quote, highly recommended. So whether or not you take 1 or 2 or 3 or 0 may depend on where you apply and how well you do on these tests. Schools that still require SAT subject tests, and it changes, are Rice and Tufts and McGill, MIT. I think Georgetown requires 3, if I'm not mistaken. Cornell, Cooper Union, Caltech. Many of these engineering programs will require at least 2, and they're often going to ask for a math subject test and probably like a physics SAT subject test. So if you plan to attend one of those schools, or really any engineering or math program, you should probably seriously consider taking at least 2 tests. The other reason to take these tests is to improve your application if you happen to do well on standardized tests. If you think you could smoke 1 or more of these SAT subject tests because you have a favorite class or a favorite subject, then they might add some pizzazz to your application, even if not required. If you're not a great test taker and they're not required or recommended, then you probably want to skip them. Question number 2, do colleges care whether I take the SAT or the ACT? No, they do not. Question number 3, is it true that Ivy League schools do not give merit scholarships? I've heard of people getting a lot of money from Ivy League schools. Well, this is true. Ivy League schools do not give merit, or athletic for that matter, scholarships to students. That's not to say that students don't get generous financial aid packages, but these are typically based on financial need, not for academics or athletics. I believe this year, if your family makes below, I think it's $75,000 a year, that you would likely be able to attend some Ivy League schools at no cost. Question number 4, how many times is too many times to sit for the SAT? Well, assuming you're fully prepared for the SAT before you take it, I would not take it more than 3 times. Ideally, you're one and done, you get the score that you're looking for, and you're out. Most people, however, typically do their best on the second try. I would not take it more than 3 times. And by the way, I don't advise taking an actual SAT cold just to see how you do. That's what the PSAT is for. And there are plenty of opportunities to take diagnostic tests that will give you a good idea of where you stand. I would not waste an actual SAT test just as a trial run. Another reason is because some schools, not that many, but they will request every single one of your test scores, no matter what. So if you're doing this just to quote unquote check out how it is and take a little practice test, you may have to reveal that score to several schools, which you may not feel that great about. Question number 5. My neighbor claims that their friend's son got a full ride scholarship in baseball to college. Can that be true? Well, technically, no. Baseball is an equivalency sport, which means it doesn't give out quote, full ride scholarships like they do for men's basketball and football, where each player is given his own specific scholarship. For equivalency sports like baseball and soccer and lacrosse and others, the head coach is given a lump sum of money that he or she can dole out to their players as they see fit. For example, a coach may be given the equivalent of 7.5 scholarships, which they can then divvy up among their 22-person roster. So if your neighbor's friend happened to be a top recruit, it's possible that the coach awarded him a disproportionate amount of his total scholarship money. It's possible that he was given enough money to pay for everything, the equivalent of a full ride, but it's pretty rare. It happens, but it's rare. Some of his teammates, on the other hand, because he's taken most of the money, they may only get $2,000 a year, $4,000 a year in scholarship money. It's all up to the coach. Question number 6, how many colleges should I apply to? Most students should try to keep their list at about 10 to 12 colleges. A few reach schools, these are the schools that are very difficult to get into, but you're really hopeful and you really aspire to those. A few safety schools, these are schools that by all counts you should get into. And then let's call it 6 to 8 match schools. These are schools that you will likely get into, but it's no guarantee, especially these days. If you start to apply to more than this number, I found that the quality goes down because each application, if it's done well, takes a lot of time and effort. And most students, frankly, don't allocate enough time to do many more applications than, say, 10 to 12. Question number 7, is it better to get an A in a non-weighted class or a B in a weighted class? This is a classic setup question. My theory is that if you think you have a greater than 50-50 chance of getting an A in the weighted class, then take the weighted class. If you do get the 8, awesome, you doubled down and you won. If you end up getting a B, however, a few things happen. Number 1, at least you gave yourself the chance to get an A. There's some value there. Number 2, you showed colleges that you were willing to challenge yourself. You get a lot of credit there. And 3, you still achieved a 4.0 in the class because it's a weighted class, so a B counts as a 4. That's not a bad outcome. Of course, with the caveat that taking this weighted class is not going to materially impact how you do in your other classes. In other words, if taking the weighted class means that your grades in your other classes might suffer, then I might pull back. Remember, the theory is you want to be challenged but successful. Question number 8, is it always better to apply early action if a college gives you the option? I would say yes, but before I explain why I like the early action option, I want to make sure that I differentiate between early action and early decision, EA versus ED, because it's a big deal. ED, early decision, means that the acceptance would be binding. This is a different story. This means that you're not only 100% sure that you want to go to that school, but also that you have the financial means to pay whatever that school tells you you have to pay. That's a pretty big commitment, and in my mind requires a lot of thought and consideration and speaking with your parents. It's a pretty big deal. But your question was about early action, which is not binding and does not obligate you financially in any way. In this case, yes, I recommend applying early action if, and this is a big if, by the way, if you're presenting your best application. If you're rushing and trying to make the deadline because you've seen and heard that the acceptance rate is higher during EA, then I would reconsider. I mean, there are a few reasons why the early action acceptance rates are typically higher than regular decision, which I will address in a different episode. But suffice it to say, don't think you can submit a subpar application early, thinking that your odds will magically go up just because you're early. That is not the case. Question number 9, what's the best way to get merit aid? Well, the best way to get merit aid is to do exceptionally well academically, and by that I mean your GPA and your standardized test scores, and then apply to a school that is slightly below where your academic scores would normally put you. For example, let's say you end up with a 4.6 GPA and a 1550 on the SAT. Instead of applying to Princeton, where your scores would be competitive, you would apply to, let's say, Fordham in New York, where your scores would be off the charts on the high end. The schools that are slightly below the highest ranking schools use merit aid to entice students like you to choose them over the Princetons of the world. They want you to go to their school, and they're willing to pay you a lot of money to do so. Not only because you'd be a great addition to their campus, but also because of your eye-popping scores. They really help out this college. They're going to raise the average student GPA that the school reports. They're going to raise the student average SAT, which ultimately will help them move up the rankings, which they care a lot about. Question number 10, how many extracurriculars do I need? I typically break this into 3 different options. Option number 1, you can have one really, really good extracurricular, like being an Olympic athlete. We call this a Tier 1 activity or a Tier 1 EC or extracurricular. Obviously, these are hard to come by. You can't sign up for a Tier 1 activity at your high school's club day in the gymnasium. It doesn't work that way. These are activities that you typically have been doing for 10 or 12 years. Or 2, you can have a few very strong ECs, extracurriculars, that you've spent a lot of time with, you've had a leadership position in, and it aligns very well with what you want to major in or study, and you've taken that activity as far as it could possibly go. We would call this a Tier 2 activity. Or option 3 is maybe you're spreading yourself thin and you're involved in a lot of different clubs and organizations and sports, but you've never really gotten into any of them. You function more like a participant or a member of the group or organization, but you haven't really dug in. We would consider that a Tier 3 or a Tier 4 extracurricular. So of course the goal is to have lots of Tier 1s and Tier 2s. Now that's hard to do because obviously Tier 1 and Tier 2 are directly proportional to how much time you spend typically. So it's hard to get lots and lots of Tier 1s or Tier 2s. So ideally you have several Tier 2s, one Tier 1 if you can, that would be helpful. Question number 11, how do I go about starting my college essay? I have zero idea where to start. I like to start with brainstorming about your life. I would draw a timeline of your life down on a piece of paper and begin to fill in what has happened. Where did you live? Did you move? What activities did you get interested in and when? Were there specific events in your life that changed you or really caught your attention or threw you for a loop that were challenging? Were there ups and downs? Have your parents help you with this. Sometimes they can fill in some of the blanks. Then add all of the things you like to do today, what you're passionate about, what classes you like, what you're thinking about in terms of a major or a field of study. Put that all down on a sheet of paper, or my preference is a big whiteboard, and then start making connections. Where have your interests clustered? And why was that the case? How has your life journey put you where you are today? Then try to think about whether or not you have one big dramatic story that happened to you, either good or bad. That could be the basis of an essay. Or maybe there's not a discrete story, but instead there's a theme that emerges that ties different interesting pieces of your life together. That may be an essay idea. By the end of your brainstorming session, it would be great if you could decide if your essay would be better told as a story, or what we call a narrative format, or a montage format that drives home a particular insight that you've learned using different parts and pieces of your life. Either one is great. That's where I would start. Question number 12. What's the best way to build a college list? Wow, we could spend weeks on this. I'm going to give you the basic premise that I like to work with. Here is the progression. Career, major, colleges that offer this major. Career goes to major, major goes to colleges that offer this major. Here's what I mean by that. I like to start with a career aspiration, if possible. I know not everyone's going to have one. They're not sure what they want to do, but it's worth thinking about nonetheless as a starting point. Once you have a possible career in mind, for instance, let's say you wanted to be a car designer, then you can do a search at bigfuture.org for majors that would support this type of career. After some research, you might find that industrial engineering majors would be a good place to start if you wanted to be a car designer. Boom, awesome. Then you can search for all colleges that offer an industrial engineering major. That will narrow down the possible list of schools to probably a few hundred colleges. Great. That's better than 4,000. This is your starting point. Now that you have a preliminary list of colleges, that you have the major that you want, now you start to filter by selectivity and geography and rural, urban, suburban, cost, those types of things. But why should you start looking for colleges that don't even have a major that you want? So start there and then go into some of the more details. Question 13. Why has it become so competitive to get into colleges? There are a bunch of reasons. I think the biggest reason is that colleges are getting a lot more applications than they used to for the same number of spots. Simple math. This means the competition has gone up. More people are applying for the same number of seats. I believe the Common Application has been in part responsible for some of that increase. Why? Because the Common App makes it very easy for students to apply to more and more colleges. Yes, there is a fee associated for every application. It might be $75. But in the big scheme of things, this doesn't stop many students from applying to lots of schools. Even kids who don't have the money, they can often get waivers, especially if these kids aren't really sure about where they might get in or not, which is the case these days because it seems so unpredictable. The Common App makes it too easy. Back in the day, when students had to apply to schools individually, with completely different essays and instructions and letters of recommendation and deadlines, students were more discerning than they are today. Today, each additional college that they apply to does not take that much additional time. You do have to do supplemental essays sometimes, but in the big scheme of things, it's nothing like it used to be. Unfortunately, this makes it harder to differentiate yourself because there are so many more people to compare you with. This is why spending time thinking about and building your application from 9th and 10th grade makes such a huge difference. Question 14. What will colleges care most about on my application? We've talked about this a couple times in other episodes. I call it the big three. Number 1, your GPA. Number 2, the rigor of your classes, meaning how challenging were the classes that you took. And number 3, your SAT or ACT score. These are the metrics that will get you through the first screen, or you will hit the first screen. Obviously, the screen is different for different colleges. It's really hard to get through MIT's preliminary screen. They want big numbers on the big three. If you don't have competitive numbers, you will hit the screen. On the other hand, there are many colleges who don't expect such eye-popping numbers. In these cases, it will be easier to make it through the screen and onto other parts of your application. The more selective the college is, the smaller the holes in the screen. Question number 15. What's the most underappreciated part of the application that people should pay more attention to? I say letters of recommendation. There are a lot of surveys out there where colleges put letters of recommendation in their top 5 or 6 things that they consider. Typically, it's after the big 3 and extracurriculars at a minimum. These letters are important. Many students leave letters of recommendation to the last minute. Why? Because it can be uncomfortable asking a teacher to write you a letter. It can feel like an imposition, so students oftentimes procrastinate. Not a good idea. The best strategy here is to get out in front of these letters and give teachers ample time to write and submit them. That's the way to get very good letters of recommendation. Question 16. When should I start studying for the SAT? Well, I'll add the SAT or the ACT in there. The answer is the summer before your junior year. That's when you should do the bulk of your studying for either the SAT or the ACT. I can also offer, when should you not start studying for the SAT or ACT? How about during the middle of junior year? If you know any juniors out there, ask them and they will agree. Do not begin your studying for the SAT in the middle of the toughest academic year of your life. Note to self. Question number 17. What do you think of a gap year? I love gap years as long as, number 1, you can afford it, and number 2, you have a plan. Don't just defer a year and assume that you'll figure something out. I would spend as much time researching and coordinating your gap year as I would applying to colleges. It's just as important. A gap year is particularly useful if you have no idea what you want to do in college. Maybe that's the reason you're taking a gap year, so take seriously what you're about to do. And hopefully, a well-designed gap year will give you some ideas about what you might want to do with your life and will allow you to make better use of your time once you get to college, if you get to college. Question number 18. What's the difference between Navy ROTC and the Naval Academy? I think it might be easiest to explain the difference by first understanding what they share, their shared goal. The mission of the Navy ROTC program and the Naval Academy is to train and educate future naval officers. The way they go about it is different. If you earn a Navy ROTC scholarship, you can apply that scholarship to a participating college and receive free tuition. Not every college participates in ROTC programs, so you'll have to check online and see what schools do or don't. There are about 130 or 40 schools that offer Navy ROTC programs. If you go to a school on an ROTC scholarship, you're basically like a normal college student, except that you take a few extra military courses, you wear a uniform on campus, normally 1 day a week, you work out in the morning with your unit, you participate in monthly drills. You're basically like a part-time military person. This is different from going to the Naval Academy, where it's a full-time experience. The Naval Academy is a full-blown immersive military college where cadets wear uniforms every day, and it's more regimented and disciplined. And by the way, the Naval Academy is 100% free, not just free tuition. It's everything for free. Plus you get a stipend. And of course, both of these programs have pluses and minuses. In both programs, when you graduate after 4 years, you then work for the Navy for 5 years at a minimum as an officer, and hopefully in a community that you're interested in, whether it's aviation or submarines or surface warfare or the Navy SEALs or explosive ordnance disposal or nuclear power. Depending on how you graduate from the Naval Academy, that will dictate which of these communities you get to choose. Question number 19. How do I get the attention of college coaches? I assume this is in the context of sports. Assuming that's the case, the first thing you need to do is get some game footage, assuming that it's a sport where video makes sense. For instance, if you row crew, you probably don't need to have video. You would just need to send a coach your times. So if you're playing a sport that needs video or video makes sense, get some video footage, create a highlight video, and send the link to your video to the coaches you're interested in and get on their radar. This should happen in 9th and 10th grade. Even though most coaches won't necessarily be able to respond to you until 11th grade in most cases because of NCAA regulations, you still want to get on their radar early. You want to demonstrate early interest. And as your career progresses, continue to update your highlights, continue to communicate with coaches, and at some point, there's going to be a window where you can actually communicate in 2 ways with the coaches. At that point, if they're interested, you usually want to try to find a time and a place where they can see you play in person. That might be a tournament or an invitational or a camp, or you might choose to attend a camp at a particular college that you're interested in to ensure that a coach and the assistant coach and the whole staff gets a good look at you. Question number 20. Is $80,000 a year for college worth it? Yeesh. Well, it depends. If you're paying $80,000 a year and a large percentage of that is with student loans, either you or your parents or a combination, then I'm very skeptical. If you're leaving school with $200,000, $250,000, $300,000 in student debt, that's a bad idea in most cases. You know, the burden that this debt could put on you and your parents, it could be crippling at best and a disaster at worst. But there are exceptions. Depending on the school and the school's perceived value in the marketplace, it could be worth it if your ambition was to work in a highly lucrative field, maybe investment banking or consulting or law or private equity, then maybe getting this credential, so to speak, would be worth it. However, if you're not sure what you want to do, or you're finding yourself, or you plan to be a communications major or a women's studies major or a medieval history major, then it probably doesn't make sense if there are other more affordable options out there. Question 21. I'm thinking about going to a community college for 2 years and then transferring to a 4-year school. Good or bad idea? Well, I really like this idea. I don't think enough people are giving this idea enough serious consideration, probably because there remains a stigma attached to not going directly to a 4-year college, as if there's something wrong with you. Well, in my opinion, if saving tens of thousands of dollars means that there's something wrong with you, then I'd opt for being wrong. The 2-year option may not be what you've always hoped and dreamed of or that you see online or with your buddies, but it's often the most practical thing to do. In the end, you'll still graduate from a 4-year college, if that's important to you, or you think it's important to those out there in the world. I'd rather save $100,000 and get a degree from UCLA after 2 years at a community college than to be $100,000 in debt after going to UCLA for 4 years. Community college may not be the right fit for everyone, but for those on a budget or those who might have a hard time getting admitted directly into a 4-year school straight out of high school, it's definitely an option worth pursuing. Question 22. How important is it that I visit a school before I apply to the school? I wouldn't say that it's mandatory to visit a school in person before you apply, but it sure would be nice to have visited that type of school that you plan to apply to. For example, let's say you want to apply to NYU, New York University, which happens to be in the middle of Manhattan, New York. It's a very urban school. I would be hesitant to apply unless I had visited a school that had a similar urban feel, urban environment, or vibe to make sure that you liked it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the NYU, but maybe a local comparable school that would be a good substitute. This would be especially important if you plan to apply to schools that are in areas that are far different from where you live right now. Question 23. I don't have the money to do a lot of expensive extracurricular activities. What can I do to build up my ECs? You can become a subject matter expert in almost anything by going to the local library and reading books on your favorite topic. You can dig into Khan Academy for free. You can take hundreds of free online courses available from colleges like MIT and Harvard and Yale. You could watch hundreds of TED Talks on a topic that fascinates you. You could volunteer or work for free for someone in an industry that you want to learn more about. You can learn a ton from YouTube videos and other free resources online. You can look for a local business that might need an intern. There are plenty of creative and affordable ways to demonstrate your interest in something that are not expensive. The trick is figuring out what that something is. Question 24. Should I take the SAT or the ACT? I have no idea. This is totally personal. Colleges don't care. I don't care. Nobody cares. But you have to figure it out. My best advice is to take a diagnostic test, an SAT and an ACT, at the end of sophomore year to figure out if you do significantly better on one versus the other before you do any studying. Now make sure that you control for the time of day. Take these two diagnostics within a few weeks of each other. Don't put months of distance between the two of them. Make sure you're taking them under strict test-taking conditions. No cheating, no petting the dog, no taking big, long breaks. Take them as if you're taking the real SAT or ACT. And then you have to ask yourself, do you have a natural predisposition for one or the other? Did you do far better on the diagnostic SAT? If so, then considering doubling down on the SAT and putting all of your time and effort into that. If it's the ACT, same thing. Point all your guns in the direction of the ACT. If you do the same on both diagnostics, then it's just your personal preference. Which one did you enjoy taking more? Okay, that's it for today's rapid fire Q&A, folks. Thank you for tuning in. We went a little off script today compared to our normal show with our rapid fire Q&A. If you like this format and would like to hear more like this, please let me know and we'll schedule a few more. If you have questions that you'd like me to answer, please also let me know. You can reach me by email, IG DMs, blog, Facebook, LinkedIn, Smokescreen, you name it. Subscribe to the podcast, please. Share it with a friend who might find it valuable. If you do have feedback or comments on the show, please fire away. And until next week, goodbye, good luck, and never stop preparing. This podcast is brought to you by PrepWell Academy. PrepWell Academy is my one-of-a-kind online mentoring program that delivers to your 9th or 10th grader a short, highly relevant video from me every week, every Sunday, in fact, where I give them a heads up about what they should be thinking about to stay ahead of the game. To get these valuable lessons into your child's hands, please head over to PrepWellAcademy.com and enroll your child today.